Hello, today I'm trying out some thumbnail concepts, sketching up an idea I wanted to try out for a Remedy cover. Let me situate this thing. Now that Remedy's to issue 4, I'm considering options for trade paperback to collect those 4 issues. I feel like I wanted to go to 5, issue 5, and I have the scripts for 5 and 6, at least to the second draft anyways, but I just sort of changed my focus to Into the Impossible for now and tried a different concept and a different format and different media with the watercolor. So sometimes I like to juggle a couple of different ideas. It helps keep the energy rolling, and going back to the Remedy for a cover like this helps keep my drawing skills up without slowing me down on some of the I guess helps me keep moving with my drawing skills while I'm still very much in the development stage of Into the Impossible, still figuring out script and design and stuff like that. So revisiting the Remedy's characters, what I was thinking of doing is all of the 4 covers that I've done all have either one, or issue 4 has 2 characters on it and no background. It's just very, very straightforward. So I was thinking of doing the opposite of that and having like an ensemble cover. Probably not all of the cast, but definitely like a large portion of the main characters. So this will be for the monster. I'm going to have her be in the back. It's a little tricky sometimes to fit all the characters in one space, especially having such a wide range of sizes, because Monster's gigantic, and Marion and Beatrix and all those characters are not. And this sketch I did just partly as a warm-up. It was interesting because I never stood Beatrix side by side with Marion, and even though I oftentimes compose the images of Beatrix to make her look like she's one of the biggest characters, she's actually one of the smallest. I've always envisioned her as being basically like 5'2", 5'4", and Marion being more like 5'6". I've always wanted them both to be relatively realistic characters figure-wise. And then, of course, having, more realistic movements and body builds and amongst the rest of the cast as well. So putting them all together side by side like this can be an interesting compositional challenge, because you have to put them in, pretending that they're all in the same space, even though story-wise they probably never do that. You kind of have to reevaluate some of the character aspects and be like, okay, well, who would be where and how would they be standing, and would there be some sort of acting going along with it, or would it be how into character do you want to get to balance all of that out and make a reasonably that's too small, reasonably appropriate composition. It's still too small. A lot of times at this stage I don't do a whole lot of erasing unless I really want to fix something. I just sort of keep drawing where I'm at, figuring out I used to be really meticulous about drawing stuff in pencil, putting all the details in there, but once I started just doing, you know, layouts in pencil and not really penciling tightly, I've gone pretty far away from that process. And just leaving that either to the ink stage or you know, just sort of sketching over top of what I lay out. Okay. Another little fun rule of making a cast like this. With comics, the tradition tended to, especially from the 90s when I started watching or reading comics, the tradition kind of geared towards making a lot of the characters basically built the same. You know, there's tended to be a little more dynamic character design in the guys, but the women always seem to be very particular to, you know, big boobs, big butts, tiny waists, and, you know, leggy, extraordinarily long legs, etc. And you still see that stuff trickle through a lot of times in the modern day design. Not as extreme, and there's definitely been, you know, a nice uptick in female artists who have taken over some of that and been much more proactive about diversity of body builds. In this, I find that having a diverse cast of character designs on the body build level makes it pretty easy to have them each have unique silhouettes, which is really important in comics because it's a great way to identify a character at a glance. You know, so I've got, you know, characters: Beatrix, Marion, Monster. This is going to be Mrs. Opotamus, and which I can actually go bigger with that with her. And then also I've got like Amy and Frank. You know, all of them. Just looking at the females in my cast, which I have a very large female cast in this book. You know, all the main characters have slightly different proportions and builds, and then you take that and you multiply it by their tendency to stand certain ways or move certain ways, and you know, everybody has their own specific identity built on these traits. And you know, once you start thinking in terms of the additive features of that, of building a cast of characters that complement each other in that kind of manner, all of a sudden the book really just, it comes much more alive to, you know, to create these wider range of identities. Each one has its own kind of its own kind of flavor, and they all work with each other and against each other to create this more interesting story. And like, I get that, you know, certain artists tend to draw characters in certain ways, mostly out of ease of skill. Like, it's easier to draw one character all the time. It's easier to draw one figure all the time. It's because drawing is hard. But the downside to that is that you got to work doubly hard to make sure that each character has its own identity and has its own personality come through in the story. Otherwise, if you're not going to help yourself out in one way, you got to work doubly hard in the other. And you know, it just is a good way that most of the certain books will absolutely fall flat on their face as far as characterization goes, because they just aren't taking care of business with the character design. And it's tricky. I mean, it's one of those things that you could definitely get the hang of if you try. Alright, I'm going to tone back the running at the mouth and think this composition out a little bit more. Because I'm just sort of dabbling as I go. I've got this shape going on. Let's see, I had Kyle here. Put Kyle there. Do I want Frank and then Amy, or Amy and then Frank? I think Amy and then Frank. Let's see, I think Frank's going to be taller. Honestly, at this point, I don't really remember how tall I wanted Frank to be. I think I typically have him about half a head taller than Marion. So he's probably, I don't know, 5'10", 6 foot, somewhere in that range. The other question in doing this sort of pose is, what do you do with, or this sort of composition is, what do you do with their poses? You know, it's pretty boring to just have them all stand there with their hands on their hips, or their arms crossed, or, you know, something like that. So I think somebody's burning something, I'm pretty sure. Smelling a weird smell. I opened up the house for once, and now that it's getting to be spring, and then we get neighbors burning shit that they probably shouldn't be burning. People are great. If you're curious about what pencil I'm using, it's just my normal, it's my main pencil that I pretty much use all the time. It's just a Rotring 600 2mm pencil with Staedtler HB lead inside. I like Staedtler's brand of, or Staedtler's HB lead better than other HBs because it's got the softness, but it erases better. Doesn't leave the grittiness, and it doesn't dig into the paper and stain the paper like other brands will. I always use a very light touch and just try to make as light of lines as I can. Now that I just use an HB and don't use the blue pencils for the layouts like I used to, it tends to build up lead into the paper a little bit more, like you see here on the legs, and sometimes that's with the HB, it's like right at that threshold where it starts digging into the paper before it makes a darker line. But usually I don't go that far because I don't like to gouge the paper too much. Being a mainly brush inker, it doesn't really matter that much because the brush flows over the gouges pretty easily, but I just don't like to have rough surface on my paper, whatever way that comes about. So I try to use a light touch as much as possible. You know, this medium soft lead, and it just makes it easier to refine things on the fly because I don't have to worry about fighting with damaged paper or something like that. Oh, one of the things I wanted to get back to about the cast is that the other part of making identities for each of them is giving them unique names. That is, like, I like to make sure that I give them a single name. Even if I know what their last name is, I like to make sure I give them a single name that is easy to remember, like Marion, Beatrix, Mrs. Opotamus, or Mrs. O, Kyle, Danny. When I think of her as Danny, but she's, you know, called the monster most of the story. Amy, Frank, all of those are very, uh, they're finding that sweet spot for this story, that they're common enough because it's a realistic superhero story. I wanted them to be common enough that people could identify them or identify with them fairly easily, but unique enough that they don't confuse one character for the next. Like, you know who Amy is versus Danny, even though they kind of sound the same, have the same amount of syllables, etc. So that's the sort of mentality I take to naming characters. Marion, that name's still, somewhat common, but it's a little more esoteric than Amy. And then Beatrix is even more so, especially the way that I use it, because I think most people kind of think of the name Beatrix or Beatrice as a nerdy kind of gentle name, maybe. And I'm using her as a character in a very different way. So, and it's playing on the sort of inbound or built-in pun of the word tricks being in her name. So, yeah, that sort of thing is all played up in those choices. Oh, Kyle. Right now I'm having the most trouble with Kyle as a character just because she's probably the newest to the cast, has the least backstory built in. I'm just trying to figure her out, what I want to do with her, because, on a certain level she's a copy of Beatrix, a cheap copy. I'm still not entirely sure how to play that up. Issue 5, I kind of play with it in the script. Oh yeah, you guys may not know who Kyle is because you haven't read issue 4 yet. I forgot. Spoilers. She's introduced in a very open way in issue 4. So you get to look forward to that one. I don't know. It feels very horizontal. All their heads pretty much line up in one row, except for Monster and Hippopotamus. Wow, it's 20 minutes in and I'm still just this far. I don't know. What else can I do? Sometimes it's useful to start out with an idea of a shape for composition and then sort of use that to form something like this into. Like, for instance, I don't know, this is a little bit more complicated than I might suggest, but using a triangle for points of interest in the picture. Like, faces in this case are pretty much the basics of points of interest. So in this instance, it's kind of this shape and this shape. So it builds a triangle, and then you could have, if you understand that, and then you can build in some secondary points of interest, because, Beatrix is habitually topless. It could be something like this. And I don't know if I'll be adding any sort of props. I'm keeping Beatrix, in the center, or at least center-ish, because she's always wearing some ridiculous costume and tends to draw tons of attention to herself. And that was on purpose, because Marion's costume is extremely simple. Like, I want Um, I want a certain quantity of visual contrast between the two to help demonstrate their personality contrasts. And also, both of them change costumes frequently, but Beatrix is always in a vastly different costume every scene. I designed her specifically to have a completely different costume every single scene, which is actually, it's something that I think I got from David Lee Roth, of all people. I remember when I was a kid watching videos, and somebody had mentioned that he changes costume, like 7 costumes in all of his videos or something like that. I don't know how accurate that is, but the notion stuck with me when I was working on Beatrix. The idea of her being in a completely different costume every single scene was fun, first of all, because it really made me flex that fashion design muscle and see how far I could go with her costumes, considering the 2 basic rules of it are she's always got her breasts out, and she always wears a neck corset of some sort, or collar or something up against her chin, or up against her jaw, rather. So, aside of those 2 notions, she's wide open as a design, and that gets to be quite a challenge sometimes, because I came to a point a few months ago when I was trying to design a new costume for issue 5 where I just felt like I was hitting a wall. I do favor having her in some sort of long skirt or long dress. I've had a few designs in my sketchbooks, at least. I don't recall off the top of my head of her being in a book in pants. I know I have a few designs in my sketchbooks that were pants, or I guess she's not wearing any skirt or pants in issue 5 or 4, issue 4. So there's that, but you just have to buy it to see what she's wearing. Yeah. I have no idea what outfit I want to put her in for this. I'm being really sloppy. There's a difference between being loose and being sloppy. I am being sloppy right now, and I don't like it. Let's flip this. Let's put, because I've got the protagonists here, the antagonists here. Let's do something. Maybe an inline. Something like that. So who would it be? Monster, Frank, Amy, Marion, Beatrix? I don't know. If it's not clear, these are their faces, but I don't know, I'm not really digging that notion. What else can I do? The other question I always have in my head is, because Beatrix is habitually topless, how do I handle her on a cover? Do I go the full Monty route and just let it out? Because I designed her knowing that she was going to be that way, partly as like the ultimate femme fatale, the ultimate good girl, bad girl kind of character. But along with that, as I've been, especially drawing her, seeing the way her toplessness, especially in issue 3, I noticed it in the courtroom scene. It was almost like she was using them like a weapon. Like, I know that's not, I know that's an odd, her boobs are her weapon, but it became, I was drawing one particular panel when she's confronting the judge and just cowing him down, and there was just nothing sexy about her toplessness. It was absolutely intimidating. And at that moment, I was like, wow, this is, there's a certain there's a certain power in it. Like it clicked for me why I've heard women say being naked is empowering, because this thing that should be taboo, that should be closed off to other people, all of a sudden you stop doing those things and your mind is let loose from that notion, that idea that you have to hide yourself. And the quality of intimidation that came through in that particular panel was just amazing to me. Even as I was drawing it, I was like, I get it. There's power in this. Like I found myself appreciating her as a character on a new level. So it was really inspiring. It was a little bit. I made it a little bit more difficult though as well, because it was after that I started realizing that option was there for me as a writer and artist. And I started thinking in terms of trying to harness that, which that's not, it's good to be able to use those things to your advantage as a storyteller, but sometimes you start thinking in a different way and it starts hindering the character as much as it might help. I don't know if that makes any kind of sense whatsoever, but I've noticed since then that I'm having a little bit more trouble with handling Beatrix as well. I guess. Anyway, it's she as a character is actually a big part of the reason why I've been kind of putting the Remedy on the back burner for a little bit to work on something that's not so intense with the content. Partly because I have two young girls in my household and I want to be able to share with them what I'm doing. And it's with Into the Impossible. It's very heavily inspired by Doctor Who, and I wanted to stretch out in a new way for that and get something that I could try some different things. Like I mentioned earlier about try different things in content, try different things in format, try different things in media, and so far it's been a challenge. I've enjoyed it. I've gotten very frustrated with it. I have no idea what I'm sketching right now, but it's been worthwhile. So anyway, I think I'm going to stop there because I'm almost a half an hour in and I've been rambling most of this. Hopefully it's been fun to watch. I haven't drawn half as much as I was hoping to for this, but anyway, have a good day, everybody.